Continuing in verse 28 of Judges chapter 6. When the men of the town rose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was broken down, and the Asherah beside it was cut down, and the second bull was offered on the altar that had been built. Gideon has been working all night long. We know that from our last study. He wasn't afraid of the men of the town, but he knew that they were going to try to stop him. He knew that they were going to be mad, and so he worked all night long. And when they woke up the next morning, they were in for a surprise. But I want us to notice what they're doing. They're getting up early in the morning to offer their sacrifices and their prayers to Baal. And they did this faithfully and diligently every single morning. And I think about a lot of us who claim to love God with all of our hearts, and yet we can barely find time to squeeze in 5 minutes with Him. These men who are idol worshipers were faithful and diligent every morning to go worship their idols. That was really convicting to me as I read it, thinking, wow, I need to do a better job at waking up earlier in the morning and spending time with the Lord, because it just doesn't seem right to me to not do it. So these men go out early in the morning and they see their beloved Baal and their idols torn down, and not just torn down, but completely destroyed. And they see an altar with fire and their wood from their idols as the fuel on this altar. They are beyond angry here. And so they say to themselves in verse 29, "Who has done this thing?" And after they had searched and inquired, they said, "Gideon, the son of Joash, has done this thing." They immediately thought of Gideon, the one person that doesn't show up in the morning to worship at their idols, the one person who's probably not there, the one person who keeps some little bit of faith in God instead of Baal. And so it's Gideon. We know it's Gideon. And so in verse 30, they go to Gideon's father, Joash. The men of the town said to Joash, "Bring out your son that he may die, for he has broken down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah beside it." So they're going to Gideon's dad and they're like, "Bring him out. We are going to make him pay for this." Now remember that Joash has idols of his own, but something happens here that the people weren't expecting. Gideon is rescued out of the hands of his enemies by his own father. Joash was one of the chief men of the city, and so his voice is going to be pretty loud as we read what he says next. Verse 31, "But Joash said to all who stood against him, 'Will you contend for Baal, or will you save him? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because his altar has been broken down.'" He tells them, go ahead, pray to Baal and ask Baal to deal with Gideon. I believe in this moment, Joash has seen the light and he's realizing his folly in worshiping idols. And what he says to the people here is, if Baal is real, you guys come out here and pray to Baal every single morning as if he is real. If he is who he says he is, let Baal deal with Gideon. Go ahead. Pray to Baal and tell Baal to deal with Gideon. I'm not going to do it. And verse 32 says, "Therefore on that day Gideon was called Jerubbaal, that is to say, let Baal contend against him, because he broke down his altar." Now this is a name that Joash gives to Gideon, which means let Baal deal with him if he can. If he has anything to say, let him say it. This would have been in direct defiance to Baal, and everybody knew it. And what this does is gives honor to Gideon. Remember, if Joash had any voice in this city, he is now throwing his support to his son Gideon. And it's also going to be an encouragement to any of the soldiers who choose to fight with Gideon. If Baal does nothing here to Gideon, what do they have to be afraid of? Verse 33 says, "Now all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east," remember that would be the Arabians, "they came together and they crossed the Jordan and encamped in the valley of Jezreel." So a large number of Midians and Amalekites and Arabians are joining together to cross the Jordan and to set up their camp in the valley of Jezreel. And this would have been in the heart of Manasseh. Remember, Manasseh is the weakest tribe. It's no wonder that they chose to set up their camp in Manasseh. A bully usually picks on the weaker kid, right? And that's what's happening here. Now, Manasseh is not far from Gideon's city. And so there's two theories as to why the enemy has set up camp and where they set up camp. The first theory is they saw Gideon destroying the idols and setting up this altar, and they're seeing smoke and fire, and they're now saying, yeah, we got a reason to go pick a fight with Israel. Let's go. That's one theory. I don't know if that's 100% correct. The second theory, which I think is more accurate, is that it's harvest time, and they're making their usual trip to raid the fields and the crops and take all the produce and the livestock for themselves. Remember a couple studies ago when we talked in chapter 6, verse 3, if we want to look back really quick, tells us that when the Israelites planted the crops, the Midianites would let them feel secure, would let them come and plant, and then at harvest time, they would raid the crops like locusts. I think that's more likely the theory, is that it's harvest time. They're coming for what they want to take for their own. And so God is now raising up Gideon to be ready. He knows that it's harvest time. He knows that the enemy is probably on their way. And the enemy has had a lot of success over the last 7 years, overtaking Israel and pushing them into the mountains and taking all their crops. And so they're confident, they're eager to do it again at this harvest time. But God is getting ready to put an end to their iniquity, put an end to their oppression that they've put on Israel. Micah 4:12 tells us this, "But they do not know the thoughts of the Lord. They do not understand his plan, that he has gathered them as sheaves to the threshing floor." The they who Micah 4:12 is talking about are people who are against God. And so how that relates here to Judges is the Lord has been working with Gideon, strengthening him to beat out the wheat, literally in verse 11. And now, just as Micah 4:12 tells us that the Lord is going to gather the enemies as sheaves of wheat, Gideon knows all about how to beat out the wheat. And that is what he is going to do here. God is raising up Gideon to come against his enemies, to beat the wheat out of these enemies. Verse 34. But the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon, and he sounded the trumpet, and the Abiezrites were called out to follow him. Let's look at how God is preparing Gideon. The first thing he says is he is clothing Gideon. We can assume that God means he's clothing him with a robe. And a robe is what a king would put on. This reflects not only honor, but it also represents a coat of armor. Like a warrior putting on his defense, God is clothing him with honor and nobility, and also with a defense. And then after Gideon is clothed, Gideon sounds the trumpet. And this would have stirred up the people with life and vigor. They would hear this trumpet blast, and it would give them an energy because they would know that God was working with Gideon for them on their behalf. And now let's look at who's coming to fight. It says the Abiezrites were called out to follow him. Who are the Abiezrites? Let's remember that the Abiezrites were the men of the city who were just super angry with Gideon for tearing down their idols. How do we know that? Let's take a quick look back. Verse 11 tells us that Gideon's father, Joash, is an Abiezrite. And then in verse 28 and verse 30, the men of the town, these men would have been Abiezrites because this is Joash's town and he is an Abiezrite. So the men of the town are Abiezrites. And now verse 34 tells us that it was these same men who were called out to follow. Was it because of the conviction that Joash stirred up in their hearts in verse 31? I believe, yes, it was. Joash spoke so much truth with so much conviction that the people of the town, the Abiezrites, were cut to the heart. And I believe they repented and probably brought things to the altar that was burning and laid it down. And so now when Gideon blows this trumpet, the Abiezrites are first to follow. Verse 35, and he sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, and they too were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they went up to meet him. These are the other tribes who are called out, who are stirred up as they go out to follow Gideon. These are the distant tribes, though. They're laying further out, so they might not even know who Gideon is or what's going on. But from this trumpet blast, they are right to assume that if there's danger in the neighboring tribes, and if they don't go out and fight and stomp out this danger, that danger is coming for them next. And so they're going to do whatever they can to defeat the common enemy. But for this next task, Gideon is going to need supernatural strength. And so when God calls people, he equips people. He allows you to use your natural strength. He uses your natural talents and your natural abilities. But then where your natural strength stops, right about here, God's supernatural strength takes over, and you're able to do more than you ever thought you were capable of. Because when God calls you, God equips you.